The conference room on the 18th floor looked out over Portsmouth Harbor, where the morning light cut across the water in long, pale strips. Nolan Price sat across from the woman who had just ended his career, her words still hanging in the air between them like smoke. 7 years, gone in 4 sentences. He meant to argue. He meant to lay out his record, his numbers, every late night he had given to Northbridge Harbor Group, while his daughter slept at home under a neighbor's watch. But when he finally lifted his eyes to the woman across the table, every word he had prepared turned to ash in his throat. Same jawline, same slight indent near the left cheekbone, same gray eyes that caught light the way harbor water did on overcast mornings. Lacey. His voice came out broken. I buried my wife. So why do you have her face? Adrian Renner called security without blinking. As the guard's hand closed around Nolan's arm, he caught a glimpse of the open folder on her desk. A photograph. Him and Marin at the weekend fish market, shot from a distance. She had been watching them. Then the elevator doors opened, and Nolan looked back one last time. Adrian stood behind the glass wall, her palm pressed flat against the surface. The exact gesture Lacey had made every time she said goodbye through a hospital window. No stranger could have known that. If this kind of story stays with you, consider subscribing. New stories go up every week, and you won't want to miss what's coming next. The box was lighter than it should have been. For 7 years of a man's working life. Nolan carried it across the parking lot with both arms, the cardboard edges cutting into his palms. Inside a coffee mug Marin had painted for him in 2nd grade, 3 notebooks filled with margin notes, a tide chart he had pinned above his monitor since his first week at Northbridge Harbor Group, and a framed photograph of the harbor at dawn that Lacey had taken the summer before she got sick. He had looked at that photograph every morning for 7 years. It had been the first thing he saw when he sat down, and the last thing he touched before he left. Now it was in a box. He set it on the hood of his truck and stood there in the August heat, not quite ready to put it in the back seat. The building rose behind him, all steel and glass, its upper floors catching the late morning light. He had spent more waking hours inside that building than he had inside his own home. He knew where the radiator on the 14th floor made a knocking sound every February. He knew which elevator ran slow, and which coffee machine on the 3rd floor dispensed cups that were always slightly too hot to hold. He knew the building the way a person knows a place they never expected to stay so long. He looked up. 18th floor. The conference room windows ran the full width of the corner office, and through the glass he could see a figure standing very still, looking down at the parking lot. Looking down at him. Adrian Renner raised her right hand and pressed her palm flat against the window. It was not a wave. It was not a gesture of apology or dismissal. It was something far more specific, a particular way of placing the hand, fingers slightly spread, palm flat, the way a person presses against glass when they cannot open the door. Lacey had done it every time he walked away from her hospital room. Every single time. Through whatever window was nearest the narrow rectangle beside the door. The larger pane at the end of the corridor. Once through the small porthole window of an ambulance. Nolan's first instinct was that no stranger could have known about it. But standing there in the parking lot, he forced himself to think more carefully. Lacey had been on social media in the years before her diagnosis, not heavily, but consistently. There had been a video he remembered now that a nurse had taken without either of them noticing. Lacey in the hallway outside her treatment room, pressing her hand to the small window in the door as Nolan walked away down the corridor. It had been posted briefly before Nolan asked for it to be taken down. But briefly was long enough. If someone had spent months watching every piece of footage they could find of Lacey, watching it repeatedly, the way a person does when they are trying to know someone they never got to meet, a gesture like that could have worked its way into the body without conscious effort. not imitation, something closer to inheritance. The thought did not comfort him. It only deepened the question. He stood in the parking lot for a long time after Adrian stepped back from the glass and disappeared into the building's interior. Nolan and Lacey had bought the house on Cutter's Lane because of the porch. That was what Lacey had said when they first walked through, not the kitchen, not the storage, not the proximity to good schools, but the porch, which ran the full length of the front of the house and faced west, so that in the evenings the light came in low and orange through the gap between the two old oaks at the edge of the yard. They had sat out there on the night they moved in, eating takeout from paper bags because nothing was unpacked yet, and Lacey had said she already felt at home. That had been 9 years ago. Nolan still sat on that porch in the evenings when Marin was asleep because he did not know how to stop. The routine had started as a way of holding on to something and had hardened over 5 years into a kind of ritual he could not name and did not examine too closely. He would sit with a cup of coffee that went cold before he finished it, and he would watch the light change until it was dark, and then he would go inside and check on Marin and go to bed. The house still held Lacey in small ways. The half-finished knit scarf she had started the winter before her diagnosis sat folded in the top drawer of the hallway console, exactly where she had left it. A grocery list in her handwriting was still stuck to the inside of a kitchen cabinet. Milk, the good coffee, more of those crackers Marin likes. And Nolan could not bring himself to throw it away, so he had simply never opened that cabinet again. In Marin's room, above the bookshelf, there was a framed photograph of Lacey holding a newborn Marin in the hospital. And every night before bed, Marin said goodnight to it, the way another child might say goodnight to a stuffed animal. Marin was 7 years old. She had her mother's gray eyes and her own particular brand of seriousness, a tendency to study a situation from all angles before committing to an opinion, a preference for facts over guesses. She asked questions that Nolan sometimes did not know how to answer, and she accepted "I don't know" as a reasonable response, which he was grateful for. On the evening after he was let go from Northbridge Harbor Group, Marin found him sitting at the kitchen table with the cardboard box in front of him still sealed. She looked at the box, then at him, then back at the box. "Did you get fired?" she asked. They called it a restructuring. She pulled out the chair across from him and sat down with the gravity of someone twice her age. "That means fired." "More or less." She thought about this. "Are we going to be okay?" "Yes," he said, and he meant it. The money was not the problem. Marin nodded, satisfied with his answer, in the way she was satisfied with facts. Then she got up, went to the refrigerator, and retrieved 2 juice boxes with the focused efficiency of a person who has decided the appropriate response to bad news is a snack. She put one in front of him and climbed back into her chair. They sat together in the kitchen, Nolan with his cold coffee and Marin with her juice box, the sealed box from the office between them on the table. He did not open it that night. What he did instead was sit at his desk after Marin went to sleep and begin searching for Adrian Rinner. What he found looked at first like the biography of a person with nothing to hide. Undergraduate degree from a well-regarded university in Boston. A decade working in maritime investment funds on the East Coast. A reputation as someone who could stabilize a struggling firm without dismantling it entirely. She had been brought into Northbridge Harbor Group 18 months ago when the company's previous leadership had driven it into a cash flow crisis. And by most accounts, she had done exactly what she was hired to do. Every piece of information confirmed the same image. A woman who had built herself carefully from the ground up and left a clean trail behind her. Until she was 18 years old. Before that, nothing. No school records in any public database. No mention in local news archives. No photographs in any context that predated her college enrollment. No hometown mentioned in any profile or interview. No reference to parents or siblings. It was as though Adrian Renner had materialized at age 18, fully formed, with a scholarship and a plan. Nolan wrote down everything he could find and then sat back and looked at what he had, which was not very much. He pulled the tide chart from the cardboard box he had decided to open it after all, and smoothed it flat on the desk beside his notes. He did not know why he took it out. It was just something to do with his hands. His phone showed 2 in the morning. He turned off the desk lamp and went upstairs, stopping as he always did in the doorway of Marin's room. She slept on her stomach with one arm hanging off the edge of the mattress, her gray eyes shut, looking in the dim light more like Lacey than he could usually bear to notice directly. He stood there for a moment. Then he went to bed. He did not sleep much. The next morning, Nolan drove to the harbor. He parked on the street above the fish market and sat in the truck with the engine off, watching the stalls open for the day. He and Marin came here most Saturday mornings. It was one of their routines, one of the ones that had survived intact. He bought whatever looked good, and Marin decided what they would eat that week, based on a system of preferences she updated constantly and never fully explained to him. Someone had taken a photograph of them here, from across the street. He looked at the angle, the stalls, the crowd, the particular stretch of cobblestone where they usually stood, and tried to work out where a person would have had to stand to get that shot. Somewhere near the old cannery building, far enough back to avoid being noticed. She had been here. She had stood within 100 feet of him and his daughter and taken a photograph, and neither of them had known. He started the truck and drove home. He was not going to let this go. The question of who Adrian Renner was had lodged itself somewhere in his chest, and he recognized the feeling. It was the same one he had lived with for years after Lacey's death. The low-grade pressure of something unresolved that would not let him rest until he pushed it all the way to the end. He was going to find out what she knew. Whatever the answer was, he told himself he would be able to handle it. He believed that right up until the moment everything changed. Fort Point Lighthouse sat at the edge of a narrow spit of land where the Piscataqua River opened into the Atlantic, and on clear days you could see the main coastline from the top of the bluff below it. Nolan had not been back since the night he proposed to Lacey, a cold October evening 9 years ago, the two of them standing at the railing with a bottle of wine they had carried up in a backpack, the lighthouse beam sweeping overhead every few seconds like a slow clock. He had not planned the proposal. He had simply found himself holding the ring box and understanding that there was no better moment, no better place, and no one else on earth he wanted to be standing next to. He had never told anyone that story. The lighthouse was not in any of their engagement photographs. It was not mentioned in the wedding program or the anniversary cards. It existed only in memory, his and Lacey's. Which was why, when he followed Adrian Renner's car along the coast road on a Thursday afternoon and watched her pull off at the Fort Point access path, he felt the ground shift under him in a way that had nothing to do with the wind coming off the water. He kept his distance, staying back among the shore grass until she had walked far enough toward the railing that she would not hear him approach. She was wearing a dark coat despite the August heat, her back to him holding something small and wooden at her side. When she lifted the lid of the box, Nolan moved closer without deciding to. The photographs were visible even from 10 feet away. He recognized the one on top immediately, the shot taken at their wedding, Lacey in the dress she had spent 3 months finding, both of them laughing at something the photographer had said. Below it, a photo of Lacey at the harbor, probably taken before they met, her hair shorter than he had ever seen it. And beneath that, a picture of Marin, at no more than 2 years old. sitting in the kitchen on Cutter's Lane. Adrian's shoulders were shaking, not from cold. Nolan did not hear Maren until she was already calling out. His neighbor had apparently misunderstood his instructions, or Maren had misunderstood his neighbor. The explanation came later in pieces and did not matter much. What mattered was that Maren was standing 10 yards behind him on the path, having spotted him from the access road, and she was looking past him at the woman standing at the railing. Adrian turned at the sound. Maren took one look at her, that face with the gray eyes and the particular angle of the jaw, and went very still. The word came out of her in a whisper, the way children sometimes say things they are not entirely sure of, but cannot stop themselves from saying. "Mom." Adrian's expression collapsed. She came down from the railing and crossed the distance between them and crouched in front of Maren with the careful movement of someone who wanted very badly to reach out but was holding herself back. "I'm not," she said. Her voice was unsteady. "I'm not your mom, sweetheart. I'm sorry." Maren studied her the way she studied everything thoroughly, without rushing to a conclusion. Then she looked at her father, who had nothing useful to offer her in that moment, and then back at the woman crouching in front of her. Adrian stood. As she did, the wooden box tilted in her grip, and one photograph slipped free, landing face down on the grass. Nolan picked it up before she could. He turned it over. On the back, in handwriting he did not recognize, were the words, "Lacey Renner Price, my twin sister. Found too late." Nolan drove Maren home and sat with her through dinner and through her bedtime routine, without saying anything about what had happened at the lighthouse. Maren did not ask. She had inherited Lacey's particular instinct for understanding when a question needed to wait. After she was asleep, Nolan sat at the kitchen table with the photograph in front of him and tried to make the facts hold still long enough to examine them. Adrian Renner was Lacey's twin sister, not a coincidence of resemblance, not a strange echo produced by grief and wishful thinking. A twin. Separated at birth by the look of it, which explained the absence of any record before age 18, the sealed adoption that would have scrubbed an infant's original identity from public view. It explained why Lacey had never mentioned a sister, because Lacey had not known. And it explained the handwriting on the back of the photograph, someone writing a private note to themselves about a person they had found only after she was already gone. What it did not explain was why Adrian had come to Northbridge Harbor Group, why she had sat across from him in that conference room and ended his employment, why she had a photograph of him and Maren taken from across the street. He did not sleep that night either. Adrian disappeared from the office for several days after the lighthouse. Nolan heard through a former colleague that she had cited a personal matter and was working remotely. He spent those days pulling public records, cross-referencing dates, trying to build a timeline that made sense. He found the adoption agency, long since closed, through a legal filing from the 1990s. He found a record of 2 infant girls placed separately in the same year. He could not access the sealed files, but he did not need to. The outline was clear enough. On the 4th day, his phone rang from a number he did not recognize. "Mr. Price." The voice was measured and slightly tired. "My name is Greta Winslow. I'm Adrian Renner's personal assistant. I've worked with her for 6 years since her Boston office. I'd like to meet with you if you're willing. Not on her behalf. She doesn't know I'm calling." They met at a coffee shop 2 blocks from the harbor. Greta Winslow was a woman in her mid-50s with the manner of someone who had spent decades observing other people's crises without being pulled into them. She ordered black coffee and folded her hands on the table and looked at him directly. "In 6 years, I've seen Adrian manage a company restructuring, a hostile acquisition attempt, and a regulatory audit that lasted 11 months, Greta said. I have never seen her lose her composure. She wrapped both hands around her mug. Since she came to Portsmouth, I have watched her sit alone in her office after hours, holding a wooden box and staring at nothing. I asked her once if she was all right. She said yes. I knew she was lying, but I didn't push. I just remembered. Nolan waited. I don't know everything, Greta continued. She hasn't told me the details. But I know she's drowning. And I know from the way she talks around certain things, your name, your daughter, that whatever is pulling her under is connected to you. She met his eyes. I'm not asking you to forgive her for what she did. I'm asking you to give her the chance to explain it, because I don't think she's going to reach out herself. She's too convinced she doesn't have the right. Why does she think that? Nolan asked. Greta considered the question carefully. Because the person she lost is someone you lost first. And she thinks her grief doesn't have the same standing as yours. He went to her apartment 2 evenings later. The building was on Harbor Row, a converted warehouse redesigned into high-end residential units. The interior was exactly what he would have expected. Clean lines, expensive restraint, nothing out of place. The living room looked like a photograph of a living room, rather than a place where a person actually lived. Adrian opened the door and stepped back to let him in without speaking. She looked like she had not been sleeping. He saw the room before she could redirect him. A door left ajar at the end of the hall, and through the gap, walls covered in photographs. Not surveillance photographs, personal ones. Lacey at various ages, assembled from whatever sources Adrian had been able to find. Social media posts, a local newspaper photograph from a charity event, a screenshot from a video. Nolan and Marin appeared in some of them. A printed copy of Marin's second-grade class portrait, which had been posted briefly on the school's public newsletter. It was not the room of someone planning harm. It was the room of someone trying to know a person they had never been allowed to meet. He turned back to Adrian, who was standing in the hallway watching him. Tell me, he said. She told him everything. She had grown up in Vermont, in a household that was, by every measure, good, loving parents, a stable home, nothing to complain about. But she had always felt the particular displacement of a person who does not quite fit the shape of the life they have been placed in. When she was in her early 30s, a colleague mentioned taking one of the consumer ancestry tests, and almost without thinking, Adrian had ordered one. She had expected nothing. What the test returned instead was a sibling match. A full sibling, genetically identical in the way that only identical twins are. It took her 2 years to track down the sealed adoption records, and when she finally had a name, it was already attached to a death certificate. Lacey Renner Price. Died 5 years ago in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. Survived by her husband and infant daughter. Adrian had found her sister the same way she had lost her, through paperwork. After that, she had done what she knew how to do, which was work. She had taken the position at Northbridge Harbor Group because it placed her in the city where Lacey had lived, where the people Lacey had loved were still living. She had told herself it was not about inserting herself into their lives. She only wanted to be near the places her sister had been. Then she had seen Nolan's name on the employee roster. I couldn't do it, Adrian said. She was sitting across from him now, her hands flat on the table. I couldn't sit in a building with you every day and look at you across a conference table knowing what I knew. And I couldn't say anything because what would I say? I'm the sister she never knew she had? I showed up 5 years too late. I have no claim on her memory, or on your grief, or on any of it. Her voice stayed level, but her jaw was tight. So I made a decision that was cowardly and wrong, and I put your name on a list. And I told myself it was better for everyone if there was distance. Nolan sat with that for a long moment. You took a photograph of my daughter, he said. I know. She's 7 years old. She doesn't know any of this exists. I know that too. Adrian looked at the table. I'm not going to try to justify it. I wanted to see her. It doesn't make it right. He should have left then. He had enough to be furious about, and the fury was real. It was not manufactured or misplaced. She had watched his family without their knowledge. She had used her position to remove him from the only consistent structure his life had outside of Maren. She had made a choice that affected both of them and justified it to herself as protection. But before he could stand, Adrian reached across to the counter and picked up a plain white envelope and held it out to him without saying anything. Inside was a single page, handwritten. He recognized the stationery immediately. Pale cream paper with a small anchor printed at the top, the kind Lacey had bought in bulk from a shop in the market district, because she liked writing letters by hand in an era when no one did anymore. He had not seen her handwriting in 5 years. If you're reading this, the letter began, then something happened, and I didn't get to do this myself. I've been trying for 3 years to find out if I have any family out there that I didn't know about. I don't know if I'll find anyone, but if I do, I want them to know about Nolan. I want them to know about the baby. I want them to understand that I have had a life that was so full of good things that sometimes it felt like more than one person deserved, and that whatever time I had was enough because of them. Nolan stopped reading. He sat at Adrian's kitchen table in her apartment that looked nothing like a home, holding a letter his dead wife had written to a sister she never found. And he could not speak for a long time. Adrian did not try to fill the silence. She sat across from him and let him have it, which was, he realized later, one of the first things she had done that felt entirely right. He did not forgive her that night, but he stopped treating her like a stranger. It happened gradually, not with a single decision, but with a series of small ones. A conversation at Maren's insistence, because Maren had asked to see the lady from the lighthouse again, and Nolan had run out of reasons to say no. An afternoon at the harbor market, the three of them walking the same route that Nolan and Maren walked every Saturday. Adrian slightly apart from them at first, and then by the third stall, walking alongside. A dinner at the house on Cutter's Lane, where Maren explained her current fish preference ranking system in complete seriousness, while Adrian listened with an expression Nolan had not yet seen on her face. Unguarded, almost undone. Maren never called her mom again. She settled on Aunt Adrian, without any adult suggesting it, the way children sometimes arrive at exactly the right word when no one is watching. Nolan watched Adrian learn slowly how to be in a place where Lacey's absence was not abstract, but specific and domestic, and present in every corner. He watched her stand in the hallway looking at the half-finished scarf without touching it. He watched her laugh at something Maren said, and then look briefly startled by her own laughter, as if she had not expected it to be available to her. He was not looking at Lacey when he watched her. That was the thing he noticed first, and it surprised him. The face was the same, but nothing else was. The voice was different. The humor was different. The way she held herself when she was uncertain was nothing like Lacey at all. He had expected looking at her to feel like a wound reopened. Instead, it felt like something else he did not have a word for yet. Then one evening in late September, when Maren was asleep and they were sitting on the porch with the light going out over the yard, Adrian told him. She did not build up to it. She simply said it while looking at the gap between the two oak trees where the last of the day's light was fading. "I've fallen in love with you," she said. "I know that's the worst possible thing I could say, and I'm saying it anyway because I think you deserve to know, and because keeping it from you feels dishonest, and I've already been dishonest with you enough." She finally turned to look at him. "I don't expect anything from it. I just needed you to know." Nolan did not answer her that night. What he felt sitting on that porch was not what he would have predicted. He had expected guilt or disorientation, or the familiar weight of grief arriving on cue. Instead, he felt something cold move through him. Not cold like rejection, but cold like the particular fear of a person standing at the edge of something very high, looking down at a thing they want and cannot quite make themselves reach for. For the first time in 5 years, something was being offered to him that he actually wanted. And that, more than anything else, was what frightened him. He did not call her the next day, or the day after that. What he did instead was return to the things that had held him together for 5 years, because they were the only tools he trusted. He took Maren to school in the morning and picked her up in the afternoon. He cooked dinner. He sat on the porch until the light was gone. He went down to the boathouse at the harbor, where he kept a small wooden dinghy that had needed repairs for longer than he could remember. And he worked on it alone in the evenings after Maren was asleep, sanding the same section of hull repeatedly without making much progress, because the point was not the boat. He told himself he needed time to think. What he did not tell himself, because it was harder to look at directly, was that the thinking was not the problem. He already knew what he felt. The problem was that knowing it frightened him in a way he had not been frightened in years. The days passed, and the fear did not diminish. It just settled, the way cold settles into a room when the heat has been off too long. The night it came to a head was a Tuesday in early October, roughly 10 days after Adrian's confession on the porch, when a storm moved in off the Atlantic, and the rain came sideways against the boathouse windows. Nolan had driven down after dinner, telling himself he would put in an hour on the dinghy and go home. 3 hours later, he was still there, sitting on an overturned crate with his back against the hull, not working. The tools were in his hands, but nothing was getting done. He had been staring at the same knot in the wood long enough that he had stopped seeing it. He was not sad. He was not angry. He was empty in the particular way that is worse than either of those things, because at least sadness has a shape you can push against. His phone buzzed on the workbench. The name on the screen was Greta Winslow. He answered it, mostly because the silence had become difficult. "Mr. Price?" Her voice was the same as it had been at the coffee shop, measured without performance. "Are you all right?" It was such an ordinary question. 4 words that people said a dozen times a day, without meaning much by them. But no one had asked him that question in a long time, not in a way that was actually waiting for an honest answer. And something about the plainness of it broke something open in him that he had not realized was sealed. His throat closed in the way it did when he was fighting something back. Greta did not prompt him. She stayed on the line, and he could hear the quiet on her end. Some distant ambient sound, a television turned low. And her patience was so complete and so without pressure that after a moment the tightness in his chest released, and he put his hand over his eyes and let himself feel the full weight of the last several weeks at once. He cried in the way that men who have held themselves together for a very long time cry, when they finally stop. Not dramatically, but thoroughly, and for longer than he expected. Greta stayed on the phone the entire time. She did not offer comfort or interpretation. She did not tell him it would be okay, or any of the other things people say when they want to wrap a wound up quickly and move on. She just stayed there, present and unhurried, until he was finished. When it was over, she said, "Get some sleep, Mr. Price." He drove home in the rain and did exactly that. It was the first full night of sleep he had gotten in weeks, and in the morning, something in him felt fractionally lighter. Not solved, but shifted, the way a stuck door sometimes moves after a change in the weather. Maren said it on a Saturday morning while they were making breakfast, about 4 days after the night in the boathouse. She was at the counter cracking eggs with the focused concentration she brought to any task requiring physical precision, and Nolan was at the stove, and they had been talking about nothing in particular when Marin set down the last egg and said without any build-up, "Aunt Adrian doesn't hug like Mom did." Nolan kept his attention on the stove. "No, Mom hugged with both arms really tight." Marin climbed onto her usual stool. "Aunt Adrian does it like she's not sure if she's allowed to yet." She considered this with the air of someone reporting a field observation. "They don't laugh the same either. Mom laughed kind of loud. Aunt Adrian laughs like she's surprised it happened." He turned from the stove to look at his daughter. "She's not Mom," Marin said simply. "I know that. I knew it at the lighthouse. I just wanted to say it out loud." She picked up her fork. "I don't think you should keep being sad about it." "About what?" Marin looked at him with the gray eyes that had always seen more than was entirely comfortable. "About whatever you're trying to figure out. You get that face like you're trying to do math that doesn't work." Nolan put the eggs on the plates and sat down across from her. He looked at his daughter serious and clear-eyed, entirely unburdened by the idea that grief and love had to occupy separate rooms, and understood something he had been circling for weeks without landing on. She had already done it. Without anyone guiding her through it, without a framework or a permission structure. Marin had simply looked at Adrian and seen Adrian. Not a replacement, not a shadow, just a new person who had appeared in their life and was still finding out where she fit. His daughter had managed in a few weeks what he had been failing to do for much longer. He found the letter that night. He was not looking for it. He had been going through the closet in the spare room, the one he had been meaning to reorganize for 2 years, when the envelope fell from between 2 boxes pushed to the back of the top shelf. It was not sealed. His name was on the front in Lacey's handwriting, and below it in smaller letters only "if." He sat down on the floor of the spare room and read it. It was not long. Lacey had never been a person who used more words than necessary. She had written it, he calculated from the date, about 6 weeks before she died, late enough that she had known the odds, clearly early enough that she had still been able to write steadily. She told him she knew he was going to try to stay in the version of their life that included her, and that she understood the impulse completely, and that she was asking him not to. Not because what they had built together was small or replaceable, but because it wasn't. Because something that had actually been good deserved to be the foundation for more good things. Not a locked room that nobody was allowed to enter anymore. She wrote, "You are going to feel like moving forward is a betrayal. It isn't. Staying still is not the same as being loyal. I know you, Nolan. I know you will confuse those two things. I'm writing this down so that when you do, you have something to argue with." And at the end, in the slightly looser handwriting of someone who is tired, "Let Marin grow up in a house that still has room for joy. That's all I'm asking. That's the whole thing." He sat on the floor of the spare room for a long time. He had cried in the boathouse earlier that week, and that had been the cry of exhaustion, of a person running out of the energy required to hold everything at arm's length. This was different. This was the cry of someone who has been given an answer to a question they had stopped believing was answerable. He had not been honoring Lacey by keeping himself empty. He had been hiding inside her memory because it was safer than the alternative. She had known he would do it. She had written him a letter about it before she died. He drove to Fort Point Lighthouse the following afternoon. The weather had cleared after the storm, and the coast road was bright and almost cold, the kind of October day that felt rinsed clean. He found Adrian at the railing. He was beginning to understand that the lighthouse was where she went when she needed to be outside of herself for a while. Outside of the Harbor Row apartment with its clean lines and 2 quiet rooms. She heard him coming and turned before he reached her. She looked like she had been prepared for something difficult. He stood next to her at the railing and looked out at the water before he spoke. "When you first walked into that conference room," he said, "I couldn't see past your face. I know that's not a thing I should say out loud, but it's the truth. Every time I looked at you, I was looking for her. And when I found the places where you weren't her, it felt like losing her again in a different way." Adrian was watching him, but not interrupting. "I'm not doing that anymore," he said. "When I look at you now, I see you. The way you listen to Marin, like everything she says is worth taking seriously. The way you stood in the hallway, looking at that scarf, and didn't touch it because you understood it wasn't yours to touch. The way you told me you loved me without asking for anything back, because you'd already decided honesty mattered more than your own comfort." He turned to look at her directly. "That's not Lacey, that's you, and I should have said that sooner." "I don't want to be loved because of what I look like," Adrian said quietly. "I know. I'm not." He held her gaze. "Lacey built who I am. She is the reason I know what it feels like to be in a life that's actually good. But she didn't take that knowledge with her when she went. She left it here." He put a hand briefly against his chest. "You're not replacing her. There's no replacement. You're something that comes after. Something different." "I think that's allowed." Adrian looked out at the water. The lighthouse beam was not running in the daylight, but its shadow fell across the bluff in a long stripe toward the sea. "She would have liked you," Nolan said. "I think she would have been relieved to know you existed, to know you found us, even if it was late." Adrian's eyes were bright. She did not look away from the water. They went to the cemetery the following morning, the three of them. It was a small coastal cemetery, set back from the road on a rise above the harbor. The kind of place where the headstones were worn smooth by salt air, and the grass was kept short by the wind as much as by any groundskeeper. Lacey's grave had a simple stone, her name, the years, and below them, the single line they had chosen together in the months before she died. She made room for everyone. Adrian carried the white heather herself. She crouched in front of the stone and arranged the flowers with careful attention. And then she stayed there for a moment, with her hands in her lap. "I'm sorry I didn't find you sooner," she said, quietly enough that it felt private, even with Nolan standing a few feet away. "I'm sorry you spent your whole life not knowing I was out there looking. I didn't know either for a long time. But I found your family, and I'm not going to let go of them." She stood. Her face was composed in the way of someone who has felt something completely and has decided to carry it rather than put it down. Marin stepped forward and placed a small white shell on the base of the headstone. A moon snail shell she had kept on her dresser since the previous summer, because she liked the spiral of it. She set it down with a deliberateness that required no explanation, and then she stepped back and took her father's hand. Nolan looked at the stone for a long moment. 5 years of standing at this spot, and the feeling was never the same twice. Today it was not the hollow ache he had come to expect. Today it was something heavier and also somehow lighter. The feeling of a thing being properly acknowledged rather than just endured. He reached over and took Adrian's hand. They walked to the shore afterward because Marin asked to, and none of them were ready to go home yet. The beach below the cemetery access path was narrow and rocky, not the kind of place for swimming, but the light on the water was extraordinary, in the way October light sometimes is, low and gold and very clear, making everything look slightly more itself than usual. Marin ran ahead, her scarf catching the wind off the water, her laugh carrying back to them above the sound of the waves. Adrian watched her, then looked at Nolan, and there was a question in her expression that she did not put into words. He understood it anyway. "Yes," he said, "we're going to be okay." She looked back at the water. After a moment, she asked quietly, "Do you think Lacey would forgive us?" Nolan watched his daughter crouch at the waterline to examine something she had found among the rocks, sea glass green and frosted by years in the water. Marin held it up toward the light and called back to them to come and look. He thought about the letter on the floor of the spare room closet. He thought about, "Let there be room for joy." "No," he said. "I think she never had anything to forgive us for." Nolan put one hand on Adrian's shoulder, and they walked toward Marin together, into the low gold light, the lighthouse standing behind them on the bluff, the way it had always stood, keeping its place, pointing the way forward for anyone willing to look up and follow it. Some people spend their whole lives waiting for permission to be happy again after a loss. Nolan's story is a reminder that moving forward was never a betrayal. It was exactly what the people who loved us most were hoping we'd find the courage to do. If this story meant something to you, subscribe and stay with us. Every week we bring you another story about ordinary people navigating love, loss, and the quiet moments that change everything. We'll see you in the next one.